The wind moved slow that evening, carrying the scent of mesquite and dust across the wide valley. The sun, a burning orange ball, was sinking behind the jagged ridges, casting long shadows that stretched like silent witnesses across the earth. The land felt alive, as if it had been holding secrets for centuries and waited for someone bold enough to uncover them. Somewhere between the hush of the desert and the cry of a lone hawk circling above, a story was already being written, one that would test the strength of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. The settlement that clung to the edge of the valley was a rough one, made of timber and stone, built by hands hardened from toil and hope. Life here was never gentle. Every day demanded grit, and every night reminded people of how fragile a life could be when measured against the wildness of the land. Yet for those who had chosen this place, there was a sense of belonging, belief that this land, despite its cruel storms and endless silence, was worth calling home. Among them was a woman whose life had not been simple. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind built from years of working the soil, tending fires and facing nights where loneliness pressed heavier than the sky full of stars above her. She was no stranger to loss, yet she had learned not to bow beneath it. Her heart, though guarded, still beat with the hope of something greater than the endless routine of survival. It was in this hard land, where strangers were often treated with suspicion and boundaries drawn sharper than blades, that she crossed paths with someone who defied everything she thought she knew. He came from a world not easily welcomed in towns like hers. Apache warrior, strong and proud, with eyes that carried both the sorrow of his people and the fire of a spirit that refused to be broken. His presence stirred whispers among settlers, but to her, he was no whisper. He was a storm, a force that could not be ignored. Their first meeting was not soft. It was edged with caution, with the distance of two worlds that had long been taught to mistrust each other. Yet as days turned into nights, and the land forced them into moments where survival outweighed suspicion, the walls between them began to fall. He spoke little at first, but when he did, his words carried weight, each one carved from honesty and depth. She found herself listening more than speaking, caught by the way he looked at the horizon as if he could see something far beyond what her eyes allowed. In a place where life was measured by the strength of one's hands and the size of one's courage, their bond grew like a wildflower pushing through stone. Neither of them had searched for it, yet it bloomed nonetheless, stubborn and alive. What began as unspoken understanding soon turned into something that neither could hide. But love here was not a simple matter of choice. It was bound by risks and shadowed by those who would not allow it. Whispers spread quickly in towns where trust was already thin. The settlers saw him not as a man but as a danger, a reminder of raids and conflicts that had scarred too many lives. And though she tried to shield her feelings, it was only a matter of time before others noticed the way her eyes softened when he was near, the way she leaned just a little closer when he spoke. To care for him meant to face not only gossip, but the threat of real danger. He knew this better than anyone. His life had been marked by battles, by the struggle to keep his people from being pushed farther from the lands they called their own. To open his heart was to expose her to those same dangers. Yet love is not something that bends easily to reason. One evening, beneath the fading sky, when the world seemed hushed as if listening, he spoke words that carried the weight of everything inside him. "I would rather lose everything," he said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on hers, than spend a single day without your love. The silence after those words was not empty. It was full of truth, of fear, of the knowledge that their lives were no longer just their own. She felt the pull of his words deep within her, and though part of her longed to run from the storm that was sure to follow, another part knew that running was no longer possible. Yet the world outside their fragile bond was already moving.
How?
Men in the town, uneasy and restless, spoke in low voices about what they had seen. Some spoke of protecting their own, others of drawing a line before it was too late. The air in the settlement grew heavier, and the woman could feel the shift even as she tried to go about her days. Eyes followed her more closely, doors seemed to close more quickly when she passed, and though no one spoke outright, the unspoken words hung between her and everyone she had once known. Still, she found herself drawn back to him, again and again, each meeting like a breath of life she had been missing. There was a steadiness in his presence, a sense that love, even when surrounded by fear, could still burn brighter than any fire. But both of them knew that such a flame could not go unnoticed forever. One night, When the stars were stretched across the sky in a silent blaze, he told her of the risks they faced. His people were weary, always watching for danger, always forced to move, where the world left them little space. To bind himself to her meant stepping into a storm of hostility from both sides. Yet when he looked at her, there was no wavering in his eyes. Love had made its claim, and he had chosen it fully, no matter the cost. She stood there, heart racing, torn between the safety of silence and the peril of standing beside him. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, the sound echoing across the valley, as if reminding her that the wild did not bend to human rules. Neither did love. And so, beneath that starlit sky, they stood facing a choice that would change everything. She knew the days ahead would not be simple, that every step would carry risk. But the question that pressed hardest was one she had yet to answer. Would she choose him, despite all the dangers, or step back into the lonely safety of the life she had always known? The night grew darker, the wind cooler, and the valley seemed to wait in silence for her answer. But before she could speak, the crunch of footsteps broke through the stillness, sharp and deliberate. Drawing closer from the shadows beyond, the footsteps came slow but steady, each one crunching against the dirt with a weight that carried more than just a man's presence. She turned her head toward the sound, her breath catching as shadows shifted at the edge of the mesquite trees. The Apache warrior stood tall beside her, his hand instinctively lowering toward the knife tied at his side. He did not move otherwise, but every line in his body showed he was ready if need called. The air between them was heavy, thick with the unknown, and the silence stretched until a figure stepped into the dim glow of the moonlight. It was a settler, one of the men from the edge of town, his shoulders broad and his eyes sharp with suspicion. He paused when he saw them together, his jaw tightening as though he had stumbled upon a truth he wished had stayed hidden. She felt the heat rush into her face, not out of shame, but because she knew what this man's eyes would carry back to the others. The Apache beside her did not flinch, did not bow his head, or shrink beneath the stare. He stood as he always did, steady as the land itself, but even in his steadiness, she could feel the storm tightening around them. The man spoke few words, only a hard, low remark about how late it was to be out in the valley. Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked back toward the direction of town, his figure swallowed once more by the shadows. The sound of his footsteps faded, but the unease he left behind clung to the night air like smoke that refused to drift away. She looked to the warrior, her heart pounding in her chest. "They will know," she whispered. His gaze did not waver, yet there was a shadow in his eyes, one that told her he had expected this moment long before it arrived. The days that followed grew heavier. Whispers traveled faster than the river when the rain swelled it. Neighbors who once greeted her with warm nods now offered little more than curt glances. Doors that once opened easily seemed to shut quicker as she passed. She felt the space around her shrinking, pressing in on her with every step she took through the narrow lanes of the settlement. Still, she tried to hold her head high, though inside, the weight of it all pulled against her. For him, the Apache life had always carried that weight. He had grown under the wide sky where survival meant knowing the language of the earth, reading tracks in the dust, listening to the wind for warnings, and watching the stars as guides. His people had taught him to live in balance, but balance was not easily kept when settlers pressed deeper into lands once free. He had seen his people pushed back, seen camps burned and families torn apart, and he had carried that memory inside him with each step he took. Yet now what filled his heart most was her face, her voice, the way her spirit seemed to carry strength even when the world seemed bent on testing it. At night, he would sit by the fire with his son, a boy with sharp eyes who watched everything but spoke little. The boy had learned early to trust silence, to let the world reveal its secrets without rushing to ask. Still, even in the boy's quiet, the warrior saw the questions building. Questions about why they stayed near the valley when it carried such danger, about why the woman from the town came to see them despite the risks. The father offered no quick answers, for he knew the boy would one day come to understand that love and loyalty were choices that often carried greater weight than survival itself. The woman, too, faced her share of questions, though they were not asked with innocence. Some were sharp, laced with warning, as if to remind her that her place was meant to remain fixed, safe within the borders of the town. But safety was not what her heart longed for. What she longed for was the truth of what she felt when she was with him. The quiet certainty that their connection was not a fleeting moment, but something carved deep as the canyons that marked the land. The mystery of their bond unsettled those who looked on from the outside. For them it was not only about two people. It was about lines that had been drawn long before, lines of fear, anger, and mistrust that no one dared cross. To cross them was to invite conflict, to stir old wounds that had never healed. Yet love, when it grows, does not ask permission from the world. It takes root where it chooses, and once rooted, it is not easily torn away. Still, the danger was real. One evening, she heard her name spoken in low tones outside her door, the voices of men who gathered not with friendliness, but with the edge of warning. They spoke of her choices, of the risk she carried not just for herself but for the whole settlement. She stood behind the wooden door, her hands trembling, listening as they spoke of taking matters into their own hands if she did not let go of what they called a reckless path. Their footsteps eventually faded, but their words lingered, echoing in her chest, long after the night grew quiet again. In the valley, he too felt the tightening grip of the world around them. His people watched him with unease, some asking why he risked his life and his son's safety for a woman who came from those who had long been seen as enemies. Some questioned whether love was worth the dangers it carried, while others turned their faces away, unwilling to speak but unable to hide their disapproval. He listened but did not waver, though in the silence of his own thoughts he knew the road ahead would not be one of peace. The land itself seemed to reflect the tension as storms began to gather more often along the horizon, rolling in with sudden fury and leaving behind a silence even more unsettling than the thunder. The woman found herself lying awake at night, listening to the sound of the wind against her window, wondering if tomorrow would bring calm or if it would bring fire. She wondered how much longer she could hold the line between what her heart wanted and what the world around her demanded. And yet, through all the suspicion, the whispers, the threats that began to take clearer shape, there were moments that gave her strength. A hand held a moment too long, a glance that carried more than words ever could. The sound of his voice steady and true as he spoke of a love that was worth any cost. Those moments burned bright enough to keep the darkness from swallowing her whole. Still, the question remained, how far would those around them go to keep the world divided? How much would they lose before love demanded a sacrifice greater than either had yet imagined? The night after she heard the voices outside her door, she walked again into the valley, the moonlight silver across the earth. She needed to see him, to hear the steadiness in his words that could quiet the storm within her. But as she neared the mesquite trees, her steps slowed. There was movement ahead, not his, not the boy's, but other shadows slipping through the brush with the quiet patience of men who had come not to speak but to act. She froze where she stood, her breath caught, her heart pounding. Knowing that the moment she feared might already be upon them, she stood in the shadows, her breath tight in her chest, as the figures moved slowly across the valley floor. Their shapes were faint under the dim light, but their intent was sharp as the knives they carried. These were not men walking by chance. They were headed toward the place where he and his boy made camp, slipping through the brush with the kind of silence that only came from practiced caution. Her heart thudded with dread, each beat louder than the last, and yet she could not bring herself to call out. She feared her voice would give her away before she could decide what must be done. Every instinct told her to run to him, to warn him, to throw herself between him and the danger that crept closer. But fear held her still. She knew these men. Some had sat in her kitchen in better days, sharing coffee, speaking of harvests and storms. Now they came with darkness in their steps, and she could not stop wondering if they truly knew what they were about to do, or if anger and mistrust had blinded them so deeply that no reason remained. He was not unaware. The Apache warrior had long ago learned to read the earth for signs of danger. The faint scuff of boots against dry ground, the smell of tobacco carried faint on the breeze, the unnatural hush of night creatures gone still, these things told him all he needed to know. He put a hand on his son's shoulder, pressing lightly as he guided the boy into the shadows near a cluster of rocks. The boy did not ask questions. His father's silence was warning enough. From his cover, he waited. His breath was calm, his body steady, but his mind carried the weight of choice. To fight meant drawing blood that could never be forgotten. To flee meant leaving behind the fragile trust that tied him to her. He thought of her face, The way her eyes carried both strength and sorrow, and he knew the bond they shared was the very reason these men now came. His love for her had drawn their anger, and he wondered if she now bore the same burden in the town's narrow streets. She, meanwhile, forced herself forward. Fear tightened her throat, but she pushed against it, her steps quick yet careful as she made her way toward his camp. Every rustle of leaves made her heart leap, but she did not stop. She knew that if she turned back now, the night would swallow her with regret. She could not let him face this storm alone. The men reached the edge of the clearing first. They crouched low, their whispers sharp and fast. One spoke of driving him out once and for all. Another muttered about teaching a lesson, while another hesitated, his voice carrying doubt about spilling blood. It was clear they had not all agreed on how far this would go, but it was also clear none of them had come to talk. He rose from the shadows, tall and silent, and stepped into the clearing. The firelight touched his face, revealing no fear, only a steady watchfulness. His knife remained at his side, his hands open but firm at his sides. He looked at them not as prey looks upon hunters, but as a man who has faced storms before and refuses to bow to another. For a moment, no one spoke. The men stared at him, their anger mixing with unease. They had come expecting him to cower or strike first, but he did neither. His calm unsettled them more than fury might have. Then one of them stepped forward, his words sharp, accusing him of bringing danger, of turning a woman of the town against her own, of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The warrior said little in reply. His words were plain, steady, spoken in the tongue of the settlers, though rough from his mouth. He told them he sought no war, that he asked only to live in peace with his boy, that what bound him to her was not a trick nor a theft, but something no man could command or forbid. His voice did not rise, yet each word carried weight, as if the land itself gave him strength. The men shifted uneasily, and it was then she stepped into the clearing. Her sudden presence startled them all, their heads snapping toward her as though she had come from nowhere. Her face was pale, but her eyes fierce, and though her hands trembled, her voice did not. She told them plainly she was not fooled, that she saw their anger for what it was, and that her choices were her own. The words fell heavy in the air, for no one had expected her to stand beside him so openly. But her defiance did not calm the storm, it fed it. One of the men cursed under his breath, another gripped his rifle tighter, and the air between them all seemed ready to break. The boy, still hidden near the rocks, watched wide-eyed, understanding more in that moment about the danger of love and loyalty than years of silence could ever teach. The conflict was no longer only about two people. It was about the boundaries between the town and the Apache, about old wounds and new fears, about the way the land itself seemed too small to hold both worlds without friction. Whispers had become actions, and actions now teetered on the edge of violence. Back in the settlement, the tension carried its own weight. Women spoke in low voices near wells, their words laced with worry about what the men were doing that night. Children, sensitive to the change in their mother's tones, grew quieter, sensing something was wrong but not understanding why. The preacher, who had long urged peace, sat in his small room with a lamp burning low, wrestling with words he feared might never reach ears ready to hear them. The woman's own neighbors watched her house with wary eyes, some out of curiosity, others out of fear that trouble would spill into their lives. The division cut deep. Some saw her as reckless, others as brave, but all knew her path was leading to a place none of them could easily follow. In the Apache's camp, the moment stretched like a taut rope. He stood unflinching, she stood beside him, and the men wavered between threat and hesitation. No blood had been shed, not yet, but the line had been drawn. He knew they would not leave this place satisfied. She knew that whatever came next would shape not only their lives but the lives of everyone who had chosen sides, whether they wished to or not. The men finally turned back, not with words of peace, but with promises spoken in hard voices, that this was not the end. Her shadows slipped once more into the night, leaving behind an air so heavy it seemed to press on the ground itself. She exhaled, her body trembling with relief and dread all at once, while he placed a hand over his son's shoulder, guiding him out from hiding. But the danger had only shifted. It had not vanished. They all knew the men would return, perhaps with more resolve, perhaps with more numbers. She knew whispers in town would become shouts, and he knew the doubts within his own people would grow louder. They stood together in the clearing, the fire between them flickering low, their eyes meeting not in triumph but in understanding. The road ahead was only growing darker, and every step forward meant facing storms greater than the one they had just endured. And as the night deepened, far across the valley, another fire burned where others gathered. Plans were being made, voices rising with anger, and decisions were set into motion that would soon come crashing into their fragile world. The night after the men left the clearing was not one of rest. The woman sat near the small fire, her hands wrapped tightly around a tin cup she could not bring herself to drink from. The boy slept close by, though even in his sleep his body seemed tense, his breaths shallow, as if he too felt the weight pressing down on them. The Apache warrior sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He did not speak, but she could sense the storm of thought behind his silence. Every flicker of the fire cast his shadow tall against the rocks, a figure shaped by strength and burden alike. When the dawn came, it brought little comfort. The valley seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with the knowledge that danger was gathering. She thought of the men's faces, the way they had looked at him, and she knew they would not leave matters unfinished. The town was already restless. By morning, whispers had hardened into plans, and plans into warnings passed from neighbor to neighbor. Some said he had to leave, others said he had to be dealt with. The preacher urged calm, but his voice was drowned out by the rumble of fear. For her, every step into town felt like walking through a place no longer her own. She went to fetch water and felt eyes watching her from behind half-closed doors. A woman she once called a friend turned away as though her presence were shameful. At the mercantile, no one spoke to her, though she could hear their voices low behind her back. The loneliness struck her harder than she expected, yet beneath it burned a fire she could not extinguish. She knew her heart had chosen, and no amount of silence or scorn could undo it. Meanwhile, in the camp, the warrior prepared. He sharpened his knife, checked the few supplies they had, and spoke softly to his son about keeping close, about listening more than speaking, about standing tall, even when the world tried to force him low. The boy listened, his young face serious, and though he said little, his eyes never left his father's. He understood more than his age suggested, and the warrior felt a pang of guilt knowing that the boy's childhood was being carved away by a world too quick to demand strength. As the sun lowered, the tension thickened. Riders were seen on the ridges, silhouettes moving against the fading light, watching but not approaching. Smoke rose from the town's chimneys, but the air felt cold, sharp with the knowledge that something was coming. The woman could not stay away.
Ow!
She left the safety of her house and returned to the valley, walking quickly, her breath catching at every sound behind her. When she reached the camp, she found him waiting as if he had known she would come. She told him of the voices, of the way the town was turning harder with each hour. He listened, his expression unreadable, then finally said what had been heavy in his chest. He told her the men would return, not in twos or threes, but in numbers. He told her they would come not only for him but for her as well, for they could not separate one from the other now. His words were steady, yet she could hear the sorrow beneath them. He had lived his life knowing danger, but she was not meant to be part of such battles. Still, she did not waver. She told him she would not turn away, that she had chosen him long before the men drew their lines. The fire between them seemed to burn brighter for a moment, as if the land itself approved of their resolve. But even as they shared that vow, the sound of distant voices carried across the valley. She froze, her breath tight, and he rose to his feet, scanning the darkness. The boy moved closer, his small frame tense, like a bowstring pulled tight. The voices grew louder, clearer now. Men gathering with purpose. Torches flickered in the distance, their flames moving like restless spirits. She counted more than she dared, the sight of them making her blood run cold. The men had come, and they had not come to talk. The torches swayed as the group spread across the valley floor, their shadows stretching long and broken across the earth. He placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back toward the shelter of the rocks. His voice was low, calm, though his eyes burned with fire. He told her to stay close, to keep the boy safe, to trust that whatever happened, he would not bend to fear. She wanted to speak, to beg him not to stand alone, but the words caught in her throat. She could only nod, her body trembling as she pulled the boy to her side. The men stopped just beyond the clearing, their torches casting a fiery glow against the dark. One of them stepped forward, the same man who had first caught sight of them together. His voice cut across the night, sharp and commanding, demanding that the warrior leave, that he take his boy and vanish from the valley, that he never again lay claim to anything near their town. His words carried not just anger, but the promise of violence if his demands were not met. The warrior stood tall, his shadow steady in the firelight. He spoke few words, but each one fell with the weight of stone. He told them this land was his as much as theirs, that he sought no fight, but would not be driven away by threats. His voice carried through the night, calm but unyielding, and his refusal struck the men harder than any weapon could. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the crackle of torches. Then another man stepped forward, his rifle glinting in the firelight, and the tension snapped taut. She held her breath, her arms tightening around the boy, her eyes fixed on the line of men. She could see the uncertainty in some faces, but in others, only hard resolve. This was no longer about reason. It was about pride, fear, and the anger that had been brewing for too long. The standoff stretched on each side, waiting for the other to make the first move. The night air grew colder, the stars burning sharp above, witnesses to the clash about to unfold. She felt her heart pound harder with each passing moment, her body caught between the urge to run and the need to stay. The boy buried his face against her side, though his eyes still peeked out, wide with fear. And then, from the ridge above, came another sound, hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster, echoing down the valley. Every head turned, torches flickering as the riders approached. The men shifted uneasily, their lines breaking slightly as they looked to see who came. The warrior's eyes narrowed, his body stiffening, for he knew these were not friends nor strangers. Whoever approached carried their own stake in the storm. The sound grew louder, closer, until the horses broke into view, their riders cloaked in shadow. The men in the clearing cursed under their breath, tightening their grip on weapons, unsure if the new arrivals came to stand with them or against them. The woman clutched the boy tighter, her breath frozen in her chest as the riders slowed, their silhouettes stark against the torchlight. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Men of the town, the Apache warrior, the woman, the boy, and now these new figures, each one waiting. Each one balanced on the edge of a moment that could break everything apart. The torches flickered, the horses snorted, and the air was thick with the weight of choices yet to be made. The woman's heart hammered as she realized that whatever came next would decide everything. It's not just her future, not just his, but the fate of the valley itself. She looked at him, saw the unshaken steadiness in his eyes, and felt both fear and courage rise within her. The night had led them to this point, and now there was no turning back. The riders reined in their horses, the leader leaning forward, his voice carrying across the clearing, low and commanding. The words he spoke were enough to send a shiver through every soul present. Words that made it clear the storm had only just begun, that the choice of how it would break was now at hand. The horses stood restless at the edge of the torchlight, their breath steaming in the cold night air. The leader of the riders leaned forward in his saddle, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He spoke with authority, calling for the men of the town to stand down before blood was spilled that none could take back. His words carried weight, for he was not just another settler, but one whose voice the town often followed. Some men lowered their weapons a fraction, uncertain now that their actions were being watched by more than their own circle. Others held firm, their faces hard with the anger they had carried this far. The Apache warrior stood steady, his gaze fixed on the rider, reading every word not only for its meaning but for its intent. He had seen enough of men's promises to know that peace offered. Under fire often carried conditions that could cut deeper than open hostility. Still, he did not speak. He waited, his silence a shield stronger than steel. The woman felt her heart pounding as she stood with the boy close against her. She searched the rider's face, hoping for something she could trust. When his eyes met hers, there was no cruelty, only the look of a man weary of strife. He called her name, told her she had stirred a storm too great to ignore, and asked her plainly if this was truly her choice. The question fell heavy on the night, every ear waiting for her answer. She stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice clear. She said that love was not a mistake, that it was not a crime, and that she would not renounce what had taken root so deeply in her heart. Her words carried across the clearing, defying the whispers, defying the threats, defying the weight of all who had tried to silence her. The warrior's eyes softened for a moment, and even the boy, though frightened, seemed to stand a little taller beside her. The men of the town shifted uneasily, for her defiance had torn away the veil they hid behind. It was no longer about suspicion or protection. It was about fear of change, fear of crossing lines they had drawn so long ago. Some muttered angrily, others lowered their eyes, ashamed. The leader of the riders held up a hand, commanding silence, and told the men that enough had been done. He warned that pressing further would bring nothing but ruin, not only upon the warrior and the woman, but upon the town itself, for violence left scars deeper than they wished to admit. Slowly, reluctantly, the men backed away. Some cursed under their breath, others cast her a look of bitterness, as if she had betrayed something sacred. But step by step, they retreated, their torches drifting back into the dark, until only the faint glow remained on the horizon. The riders, too, turned their horses, leaving the valley as silently as they had entered. At last, the night grew quiet again, though the silence was heavy with what had almost come. She stood in the clearing, her breath unsteady, and felt the warrior's hand rest gently on her shoulder. The boy came to her side, and together they stood watching the valley return to darkness. The fire crackled low, the stars above burning sharp and endless. No words were spoken, for none were needed. They had faced the storm and stood unbroken, yet they knew this was not an ending of ease. The world around them would not change overnight. In the days that followed, the settlement wore its unease like a second skin. Some avoided her altogether, unwilling to look her in the eye. Others whispered still, though their words carried less force now that open action had failed. A few, quietly and cautiously, showed small gestures of kindness, an extra sack of flour left at her door, a nod of acknowledgement where once there had been silence. The preacher spoke on Sundays of the strength it took to stand true to one's heart, though he never named names. For the warrior, life remained a balance between caution and resolve. He did not seek the town's approval, nor did he bend under its scorn. He tended to his boy, hunted in the valley, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his place was not granted by others but claimed by the strength of his spirit. His people still watched him with mixed eyes, some questioning his choices, others beginning to understand that love had bound him to something greater than the boundaries drawn by men. The boy grew in ways that surprised them both. Where once he carried silence as his shield, he began to speak more, asking questions about the land, about the town, about the meaning of standing firm when the world pressed hard. His father's lessons, once spoken in hushed tones, became lessons of courage and truth. The woman's presence softened his edges, giving him glimpses of care and warmth he had long missed. In his young heart, the valley was no longer a place divided, but a place where love had stitched two worlds together. Seasons turned. The land, harsh as ever, demanded labor and grit from all who called it home. The tension that had threatened to tear the settlement apart slowly ebbed, not forgotten, but dulled by the passage of time. People began to see that the warrior had not brought ruin, that the woman had not abandoned her kind, but had simply chosen a truth they had been too afraid to face. There were still those who held bitterness, who clung to old fears, but even they could not deny that life went on. Crops still grew, storms still came, children still laughed in the dust. And slowly, almost quietly, respect began to take the place of suspicion. It was not spoken openly, not yet, but it lived in the way men no longer raised rifles when they saw him, in the way women no longer pulled their children close when she walked by his side. For her, the journey had been one of courage. She had chosen love, knowing it might cost her everything. Yet she found that in losing the comfort of acceptance, she had gained something greater: truth. For him, the journey had been one of endurance. He had faced hatred and fear without bending, and in doing so, he had shown that love was not weakness, but strength. Together, they built a life not free of hardship, but full of meaning. The boy, standing at the edge of the valley one evening, looked to his father and then to her. He asked if love was always so hard. She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his brow, and told him that sometimes it was, but that the hardest paths often led to the strongest truths. His father added quietly that love was worth any cost, for it gave reason to fight and reason to endure. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky in fire. They stood together, man, woman, and boy, bound, not by the approval of the world, but by the strength of their choice. The valley stretched wide before them, harsh and beautiful, carrying the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. And though the land would never be free of struggle, they knew they had carved a place for themselves in it. A place built not on fear or division, but on the courage to hold fast to love even when the world stood against them. Her heart swelled as she remembered the words he had spoken under the fading sky, words that had once filled her with both fear and hope. "I would rather lose everything," he had said, "than spend a single day without your love." Now, as the night wind carried the scent of mesquite and the stars began to glow above, she knew those words were not just a vow, but the truth of the life they had chosen together. The valley kept its silence, holding their story as it had held so many before. And in that silence was Pisetta, kind that comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the presence of something greater. Something worth every trial they had faced,